The day Bessie Langley rode into Harrow Creek, Wyoming territory, in the spring of 1882, she arrived with a split saddle strap, $17.40 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and the particular kind of quietness that comes not from peace, but from having been silenced so many times that a person eventually stops expecting to be heard. She was 24 years old, and she had spent most of those years being told, in various ways both large and small, that she was not quite right, not quite smart enough to manage the books at her father's dry goods store in Laramie, not quite pretty enough to hold the attention of the young men her mother paraded in front of her at church socials, not quite capable enough to run the small homestead her parents had left her when they passed, first her father to a fever in the winter of 1879, and then her mother the following year to a grief that had quietly hollowed her out like a fire in a dead tree. The homestead had been sold by her uncle before the grass had finished greening over her mother's grave, and Bessie had not been consulted, because nobody thought to consult Bessie about anything. She had worked for 3 years after that in Laramie doing laundry and mending for the boarding house on Custer Street, and she had been good at it, which was the kind of thing nobody noticed because goodness done quietly by a woman with chapped hands is not the sort of thing people remark upon. The woman who owned the boarding house, a sharp-boned woman named Mrs. Holt, had told Bessie on a fairly regular basis that she was sloppy with the collar starch, that she was slow with the mending, that she had no head for figures when it came to the weekly accounts, and that her disposition was too morose to be useful in a place where cheerfulness was expected. Bessie had listened to all of this and absorbed it the way dry ground absorbs rain, thoroughly and without argument, because she had no particular reason to believe Mrs. Holt was wrong. People had been saying things like that her whole life. At some point, a person simply accepts the shape the world has decided they are. It was the advertisement in the Laramie newspaper that had changed things, or at least rearranged them. A ranch outside Harrow Creek was looking for a housekeeper. The notice was plain and practical. It described a working cattle ranch in need of someone to manage the domestic affairs of the household, which included cooking, cleaning, and keeping accounts. Fair wages. A room of her own. References required, which Bessie had managed in the form of a stiff and lukewarm letter from Mrs. Holt that said Bessie was hardworking but unremarkable, which was probably the kindest thing that woman had ever said about anyone. She had written back to the address in the advertisement, and a letter had come in return written in a firm, spare hand on paper that smelled faintly of horses and wood smoke. The letter confirmed the position, gave directions, mentioned that the ranch was called the Double D, and was signed by someone named Henry Dalton, which told Bessie almost nothing except that the person who had written it was either very confident or very tired, because there was almost no excess in it, just the facts arranged plainly, like fence posts. She had packed everything she owned into a single trunk and a leather satchel, given her notice to Mrs. Holt, who had said good luck and meant something closer to good riddance, and taken the stage to a small town called Ridgeline before hiring a horse from the livery and riding the remaining 30 miles west toward Harrow Creek on her own. This was perhaps not the wisest decision she had ever made, but wisdom had never been a luxury she could afford. She was practical, and riding alone was cheaper than hiring someone to accompany her, and besides, nobody had ever offered to accompany her anywhere, so the habit of going alone was deeply established by now. The saddle strap had split about 10 miles outside of Harrow Creek, which was how she found herself on the main street of that small and sun-beaten town, with her horse walking slowly, and her dignity requiring what she privately considered a heroic amount of maintenance. Harrow Creek was not an impressive place in the spring of 1882. It had a general store, a saloon called the Dusty Bell, a small church that looked like it had been built during a moment of high optimism and never quite recovered from the reality of the plains, a blacksmith's shop, a doctor's office, a land office, and a scattering of houses ranging from tidy to sorrowful. The streets were unpaved and the wind had made sure everyone knew it. There were maybe 400 people living in and around the town, most of them ranchers or farmers or the various trades that served them, and the whole place had the feeling of something that was trying very hard to become permanent and was not entirely sure it was going to manage it. Bessie stopped at the blacksmith shop first because the saddle needed attention before anything else did. The blacksmith was a large, cheerful man named Augustus Webb who had enormous hands and a disposition so warm it was almost alarming, and he looked at the split strap and told her he could have it fixed in 20 minutes, and that he would charge her 40 cents for the trouble. Bessie paid him and sat on the bench outside his shop and watched Harrow Creek go about its afternoon while she waited. That was where she first saw Henry Dalton. He came out of the general store carrying a large paper-wrapped parcel under one arm and a coil of rope over his shoulder, and he was talking to an older man with a gray beard, who was gesturing with some animation about something Bessie could not hear from where she sat. Henry Dalton was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with the lean, weathered quality that belonged to men who spent most of their time outdoors doing hard work. He was wearing a plain chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and canvas trousers with a belt that had a plain silver buckle, and his hat was brown and had clearly been through considerable weather. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where the sweat had made it damp, and a face that was not conventionally handsome so much as it was honest. There was something in his expression, even at this distance, even when he was doing nothing more than listening to an old man talk about something Bessie could not hear, that suggested he was paying real attention. Not performing attention, the way some people did, but actually hearing what was being said and letting it matter. She noticed this because she was a person who paid close attention to how other people listened, having spent most of her life hoping to be listened to by someone. She looked away before he could catch her watching. The saddle strap was fixed in 22 minutes, which was slightly longer than Augustus Webb had promised, but still within what Bessie considered a reasonable margin. She paid him and thanked him and asked directions to the Double D Ranch, and he gave them cheerfully along with the information that Henry Dalton was a good man, and that she would find the ranch about 8 miles southwest of town, following the creek road until it branched, and then taking the left fork up through the cottonwoods. She did not mention that she had already seen Henry Dalton from a bench outside his shop. The creek road was beautiful in a way that surprised her. Wyoming in late spring had the quality of something just waking up, tender and a little raw, the new grass very green against the older brown of last year's growth, the cottonwoods putting out their pale leaves, the creek running clear and quick with the snowmelt from the mountains that stood blue and enormous in the west. Bessie had grown up in Laramie, which was not exactly a paradise of natural beauty, and then spent 3 years looking at the inside of a boarding house laundry, and the openness of this landscape did something to her chest that she could not quite name. It felt like being allowed to breathe deeply for the first time in a very long while. The Double D Ranch sat in a wide, shallow valley where 2 seasonal creeks met, and where the grass was thick and already a vivid spring green. The main house was modest but solid, built from timber and stone, with a wide porch and a good roof, and the kind of careful, unglamorous maintenance that spoke of someone who valued things lasting over things being impressive. There was a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a corral where 3 horses were standing in the afternoon sun with the comfortable indifference of animals who have enough. There was also a kitchen garden that had been recently turned but not yet planted, and this small detail, the turned earth waiting for something to be put into it, struck Bessie as hopeful in a way she could not entirely explain. A young man came out of the barn when he heard her approach. He was perhaps 19, with a freckled face and an expression of tremendous goodwill. He introduced himself as Billy Marsh, one of Henry's ranch hands, and took her horse with practiced ease, telling her that Mr. Dalton was out checking the north fence but would be back before supper, and that she should go on inside because Mrs. Grover, who cooked for the ranch, had been there all afternoon getting the house put together for her arrival. Bessie thanked him and carried her trunk and satchel up to the porch and knocked, though the door was open. The woman who appeared from the kitchen was perhaps 60, stout and quick-eyed, with iron-gray hair pinned firmly at the back of her head, and a no-nonsense manner that Bessie found immediately comfortable because it was familiar. Her name was Ruth Grover, and she had been cooking for the Double D for 12 years, she said, but her knees had made it clear that the time had come for her to stop, and she was going to her daughter's place in Colorado in 2 weeks' time, and so they needed someone to take over. She showed Bessie around the house with brisk efficiency. The main room was comfortable and plain. The kitchen was well stocked and well organized. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, the largest belonging to Henry, a smaller one that had apparently been used for storage that had been cleared out and made into Bessie's room, and a third that had been his brother's and was kept closed. Downstairs there was a small study where Henry did the ranch accounts, and a dining room, and the large kitchen with its good iron stove. Ruth Grover showed her the pantry inventory and the account books with the household expenses, and told her what was needed each week from town, and what could be grown or produced at the ranch, and how Henry preferred his coffee, and that he did not like a fuss made over food, but that the hands expected a real meal at midday and supper, and that Billy was allergic to something in dried beans, which she had discovered the hard way. Bessie took notes in the small journal she kept and listened carefully and asked several good practical questions, and she saw something flicker briefly in Ruth Grover's expression that might have been approval or might simply have been relief. "You'll do fine," Ruth said, which was as close to a compliment as the woman appeared able to get, and Bessie stored it carefully. Henry Dalton came in at just past 6 in the evening. She heard him on the porch first, the sound of boots and the quiet word he spoke to someone outside, probably Billy, and then the door opened and he came in and stopped when he saw her standing in the kitchen doorway because Ruth had already gone home for the evening. He was dustier than he had been in town and tireder, but his expression when he looked at her was open, and without any of the calculation that some men put into the looking. He pulled his hat off and said, "Miss Langley, I'm Henry Dalton. I'm glad you made it." "Thank you for the position," Bessie said. She was aware that she sounded formal and wished she didn't, but formality was the armor she had been wearing for so long that she had forgotten what she looked like without it. "I hope the ride wasn't too hard," he said. "Road from Ridgeline can be rough in spots." "It was fine," she said. "The saddle strap gave out near town, but the blacksmith fixed it." "Augustus Webb," Henry said, nodding. "Good man." He paused, looking at her in that way that was not intrusive but was genuinely present, as if she was a person worth looking at properly. "Has Ruth shown you everything?" "She has. I've looked through the accounts and the pantry. I think I understand what's needed." "Good." He went to the washstand in the corner and poured water into the basin and washed his hands and face, and Bessie turned back to the stove where she had been keeping the supper Ruth had prepared earlier warm, because it felt like the right thing to do, to give him a moment without her eyes on him. "Do you cook?" he asked from behind her. "Yes." "Ruth left stew and cornbread tonight, but I'll take over the cooking from tomorrow." "You don't have to," he said. "The cooking's separate. Mrs. Grover's leaving for her daughter's place in 2 weeks, but I could find someone in town for that part." "I can cook," Bessie said, with perhaps slightly more certainty than she had intended. There was a brief silence, and then he said, with a tone that was not patronizing but was simply matter-of-fact, "All right, then." They ate supper together that first night at the kitchen table, because the dining room table was too formal for 2 people eating stew, or at least that was the unspoken understanding that developed when Bessie simply set 2 plates at the kitchen table, and he sat down without comment. The conversation was careful and not particularly flowing, but it was not unpleasant. He told her about the ranch, which ran about 300 head of cattle and employed 4 hands besides himself, Billy Marsh and 3 others named Pete Holloway, Domingo Reyes, and Sam Tucker, who was the oldest and had been with the ranch since Henry's father had built it. He told her the main concerns for the spring were the north fence, which had been damaged in a winter storm, and the calving, which was mostly finished but had 3 stragglers. He told her his sister lived in Cheyenne and came to visit twice a year. He mentioned his brother only in the context of the closed bedroom, saying that James had passed 2 years ago and that the room stayed as it was, which was a practical enough statement but held something behind it that Bessie did not probe. She told him she was from Laramie, that she had worked at Mrs. Holt's boarding house, that she was good with accounts and with cooking and with keeping a house running. She did not tell him about her parents, or about the homestead her uncle had sold, or about any of the particular history that had made her into someone who traveled alone to a stranger's ranch in Wyoming with $17.40 and a lukewarm letter of recommendation. There was nothing deceptive in the omission. It was simply that she had learned to lead with her usefulness rather than her story, because usefulness was the only thing she had ever been given credit for, and even that only barely. The weeks that followed were busy in the plain and satisfying way that working a homestead in spring always was. Bessie threw herself into the work with the same focused intensity she had brought to everything she had ever done, because she had never known how to do things by halves. She cooked 3 meals a day, first for Henry and then, when the hands came in for noon dinner, for all 5 of them, learning quickly what each man liked and disliked and how much food 5 working men needed, which was considerably more than she had initially estimated. She reorganized the pantry and the cellar and planted the kitchen garden, putting in the things that would grow well in Wyoming's short growing season and that would keep: potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, beans, a small section of summer squash. She went over the household accounts and found 2 places where Ruth Grover had been slightly overcharged by the general store for the past several months, not from dishonesty on the store's part but from arithmetic errors, and she noted these carefully and corrected them going forward. She also, because it needed doing and nobody else had time for it, helped mend the fence in the kitchen garden where a deer had pushed through it in the winter, repaired a chair in the main room that had a cracked leg, and began quietly working through the pile of mending in the basket by the bedroom door that had apparently been accumulating since Ruth Grover's vision had started to fail her. Henry noticed all of this. She could tell because he had the quality of a man who noticed things without making performances of the noticing. He would come in some evenings and stop for a moment, looking at something that had changed, and then continue on without comment. But the noticing was there in the way he moved through rooms that were slowly becoming more ordered, more cared for, like something being gently reclaimed from neglect. It was about 10 days after her arrival that she first heard him play. She had been up late, later than was her habit, because she had wanted to finish mending Billy's coat, which had a tear in the shoulder that would only get worse if left. The ranch was quiet. The hands were in the bunkhouse. The night was clear and cold in the way Wyoming nights in May could still be cold, and the stars were very bright through the kitchen window. She had been sitting by the lamp in the main room with her mending when she heard the sound from the study, low and careful, the sound of a guitar being played very quietly, as if the player did not want to be heard. She sat very still and listened. He was playing something she did not know, a slow melody without any particular flourish, the kind of music that sounded like it had been discovered rather than composed, like something found in the back of a drawer. It was not perfect playing. There were small hesitations and a missed note or two, but it was sincere in the way that unpracticed sincerity always is, and it was unexpectedly beautiful. She did not move or make a sound, and after perhaps 15 minutes the playing stopped, and she heard the soft click of the study door and his footsteps going up the stairs, and she sat in the quiet for a long time after that, her mending forgotten in her lap, feeling something she could not have named precisely, but that had to do with the unsettling discovery that Henry Dalton was more complicated than she had expected him to be. This mattered to her in ways she was not ready to examine. The first real conversation they had, the kind that went past practical information and into something more personal, happened on a Saturday afternoon in late May when a sudden storm blew in off the mountains and trapped them both inside while the hands took shelter in the bunkhouse. Bessie had been baking, because the rain days were good for baking, and Henry had come in from the barn where he had been settling the horses and was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her roll pastry with the particular concentration of a man who does not know quite what to do with himself when the weather takes away his work. "You don't have to stand there," Bessie said without looking up. "You can sit down." There was a brief pause, and then she heard the chair scrape and he sat at the kitchen table. She could feel him watching her work, which she would normally have found unsettling, but there was nothing critical in his gaze. He was watching the way you watched someone do something they were good at. "My mother used to bake on rainy days," he said. "The whole house smelled like something good was coming." "When did she pass?" Bessie asked, because the past tense of the statement was clear, and she did not see the point in pretending she had not heard it. 8 years ago, he said. "My father 4 years after that. It's been just me and the ranch since James died 2 years back." "I'm sorry about your brother," Bessie said, and she meant it. She knew something about how grief could hollow out a house. "He was 31, Henry said. "Fever took him fast, 10 days from the first sign of it to the end." He paused. "My father built this place in 1861. He always meant for it to be James's and mine together. James was the one who had the ideas, always wanting to expand, try different things. I'm more steady." "Steady isn't a small thing," Bessie said. She had not meant to say anything particular by it. It had simply struck her as true, and she had said it. The way you say things when your hands are busy with something else, and your social guards are slightly lowered. But the silence that followed it had a quality that made her aware she had said something that landed differently than she intended. "Nobody said that to me in a while," Henry said quietly. She looked up then and found him watching her with an expression that was careful and not quite guarded, but that had something waiting in it, something patient, like a man who has learned to be careful about where he allows himself to hope. "It's true, though," she said, and went back to her pastry. The storm lasted most of the afternoon, and they talked, not continuously, but in the way of two people who are both getting used to the idea that talking to each other is something they are allowed to do. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride when he was 5 and to rope at 7, about the particular winter of 1871, when a blizzard had kept the whole family inside for 2 weeks, and his father had taught him and James to play chess on a board his mother had carved from pieces of pine. He told her about the cattle drive he had done in 1877, pushing a herd north to the railroad at Cheyenne, and about a man on that drive named Old Connolly, who had known more about weather than anyone Henry had ever met and could tell from the color of the sky at dawn what kind of day they were going to have. He told her about his sister Clara, who was 26 and married to a good man who worked at the land office in Cheyenne, and who sent long letters full of opinions that Henry always enjoyed even when he didn't agree with them. Bessie told him things too, carefully chosen things, things that were true but not the most vulnerable true things. She told him about Laramie in winter, which was spectacular in a brutal sort of way. She told him about a book she had read 3 times because the boarding house had a small shelf of books, and this one had been worth reading 3 times. A collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that Mrs. Holt had acquired somehow and apparently never opened. She told him that she had always wanted a kitchen garden, and that the one here was already making her happy, which was true and the most personal thing she said. And she watched his face as she said it and saw that he understood there was more in the statement than the surface of it. The pie she made that day was apple with a cinnamon crust, and when she sliced it and put a piece in front of him, and he tasted it and looked up at her with something uncomplicated and genuine in his expression and said, "This is the best pie I've eaten in about 3 years." She felt something in her chest do a thing she was not prepared for, a small, warm, dangerous thing, and she turned back to the stove before he could see it on her face. June came in with long golden days and the particular richness of the Wyoming high plains in early summer. The cattle were out on the grazing range. The garden was coming up. The house had settled into a rhythm that felt, in a way Bessie was still getting used to, like something that belonged to her as much as to anyone. She had stopped bracing for criticism. Not entirely, because the bracing was so old and so deep that stopping it entirely would have required more time than 6 weeks could provide. But the edge of constant anticipatory tension had eased somewhat, because Henry Dalton did not criticize. This was itself a remarkable and somewhat disconcerting thing. He thanked her for meals. He thanked her when she fixed things. When she found the accounting error with the general store and corrected it and told him about it, he did not say, "Well, you should have caught that sooner," or "Did Ruth know about this?" He simply looked at her numbers and said that was good catching and that she should keep an eye on it going forward. When she suggested that the root cellar needed restocking differently to prevent the moisture problem she had noticed, he listened to her suggestion and said it sounded right and asked if she needed Billy to help move anything heavy. She was not used to being listened to. It was both wonderful and slightly off-balancing, the way stepping onto ground you thought would be soft and finding it solid under your feet is slightly off-balancing. Domingo Reyes, who was 25 and the son of a vaquero from Sonora who had come north with a cattle drive and stayed, had a way of watching Bessie and Henry at the noon meal that suggested he had noticed something before either of them had admitted it to themselves. He was a perceptive man, Domingo, with a dry humor and a genuine kindness that he wore without self-consciousness, and he and Bessie had developed a comfortable, friendly working relationship, based largely on the fact that Bessie made good food and Domingo had introduced her to the proper way to make chili verde, standing at her kitchen stove on a Sunday afternoon showing her which peppers to use, and the correct proportion of things with the grave seriousness of a man passing on important knowledge. It was Domingo who came to find her one morning in early June when she was hanging the laundry in the side yard, because Billy Marsh had cut his hand badly on a piece of wire fence and Henry had ridden out to the far pasture, and they needed someone to see to the wound until Doc Henshaw in town could be fetched. Bessie had some basic medical knowledge, the kind that any practical woman of her era accumulated because you could not wait for a doctor every time someone needed something. And she cleaned the cut and bound it properly and told Billy to sit still and stop making faces, as if he were being subjected to something extraordinary when she was only washing out a cut. And Billy said she was worse than his mother, and Bessie said she would take that as a compliment. And Billy laughed and said he guessed he would too. When Henry came back and found Billy with a neatly bandaged hand and Bessie back in the kitchen putting the first aid supplies away, he looked at the bandaging and then at Bessie and said, "You did this?" "Yes," she said. "It's good work," he said. And then, after a beat, "Thank you, Bessie." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had been Miss Langley until that moment, which was proper and correct, and she had expected it to stay that way. But he had said Bessie the way you said a word you had been thinking about for a while, just casually enough to pretend you weren't, and it landed in the room between them and stayed there after he had gone back outside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment just letting it sit there. July brought heat, and a cattle buyer from Casper named Whitfield who arrived at the ranch with 2 assistants and a lot of opinions about the price of beef. And for 3 days the house was full of the particular tension of negotiation, which Bessie observed from a respectful distance, while making sure there was always coffee and food available, because she had learned that negotiations went better when people were fed. She watched Henry in these days with the careful attention she had developed for watching him generally, and she noticed that he was a precise negotiator, not aggressive but absolutely certain of his numbers and his position, and that Whitfield, who had clearly expected a lonely ranch owner in need of quick cash, was forced to revise that expectation somewhat. The final price was not everything Henry had wanted, but it was fair, and when Whitfield and his men rode out on the third day, Henry came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down and rubbed the back of his neck and said, "I'd rather be out with the cattle." "I know," Bessie said, "but you held your ground well." He looked at her with a slight frown that was not unfriendly. "You were paying attention." "I'm always paying attention," she said, and it was only after she said it that she realized how it sounded, and she felt the heat come up in her face and turned to do something with the bread she was shaping that did not really need doing. "Good," he said quietly, and she could hear something in the word that was not just acknowledgement. She did not turn around until she heard him get up and go outside. It was Clara who came to the ranch for a visit in the middle of July, arriving on a Saturday afternoon with 2 bags and the confident, sweeping energy of a woman who had opinions about everything and intended to share them. She was 26 and dark-haired like her brother, with a quick smile and eyes that missed nothing. Her husband Thomas, she explained, was busy with the land office and had sent his regards and would try to come for the fall visit. She had come now, she said, because Henry's last letter had mentioned that he had hired a new housekeeper, and she wanted to see for herself. She said this with complete directness, standing in the kitchen, looking at Bessie with an expression that was assessing but not unkind. Bessie said, "You mean you wanted to see if he'd hired someone sensible?" Clara blinked and then laughed with genuine delight. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. He once hired a hand who he trusted too much with a situation requiring better judgment, and we don't need that kind of thing happening with someone who lives in the house." "She means I have historically been too trusting," Henry said from the doorway, with a tone that was dry and resigned and fond all at once. "I mean you see the best in people sometimes before you have verified that the best is actually there," Clara said, "which is a lovely quality in a brother and a slightly maddening quality in a ranch owner." Bessie found she liked Clara enormously. Clara liked her back with what appeared to be immediate and genuine enthusiasm, which Bessie was not entirely sure what to do with because nobody had ever liked her immediately, and with genuine enthusiasm before. Clara helped her in the kitchen that evening in a cheerful, somewhat chaotic way that involved dropping an onion and asking 3 questions at once, and not minding at all when Bessie told her to stand back from the stove before she burned herself. "He talks about you in his letters," Clara said that evening quietly, while Henry was out on the porch with Sam Tucker going over something about the south pasture fencing. Bessie looked at her carefully. "What does he say?" "He says you're the most competent person he's met in a long time," Clara said. "He says you fixed the ledger errors and planted the whole kitchen garden, and that the house has never been this well run. He says you made a pie that was the best pie he'd had in years." She paused, watching Bessie's face. "He mentions you a good deal for someone who is only describing a professional arrangement." Bessie looked at the bread she was slicing and said nothing. "He's a good man," Clara said. "Not a perfect man. He goes quiet when he's hurting, and he works too hard, and he still hasn't fully let himself grieve James properly. But he's genuinely good. He means what he says, and he says what he means, and he has not once, in his entire life, been unkind to a woman." "I know," Bessie said, before she could stop herself. Clara's expression shifted into something that was very close to a smile, but was also very wise. "I thought so," she said, and changed the subject with the grace of someone who knew when to step back. Clara stayed for 4 days, and in those 4 days Bessie watched Henry in a different way than she had before, the way you look at something when you have been given a new piece of information and are trying to fit it into the picture you have already been building. She noticed that he was indeed good to his sister, easy and warm in a way he was not easy and warm with everyone, that the two of them had a shorthand built from years of shared experience. She noticed that he went out to the barn late on the second evening, and when she checked from the window, he was standing outside it in the dark for a long time just looking at the sky, and she understood that this was something to do with James. She noticed that he watched her with the kind of attention that was trying to be careful, but was not always managing it. On the third evening, after supper, Clara insisted on playing cards, and the four of them, because Billy Marsh had been included and was delighted about it, sat at the kitchen table playing a game called 7-Up that Clara taught everyone with brisk authority. Henry sat across from Bessie, and she was very careful not to look at him too often, and mostly succeeded. And when she did look at him, he was watching her with the expression she was beginning to think of as his thinking expression. The one that meant something was being worked out behind his eyes. He beat her at cards by a significant margin, and when she accused him of knowing the game better than he had implied when they started, he said with perfectly innocent gravity that he had merely gotten lucky, and she told him she did not believe that for a single moment, and he smiled. Not the polite smile she had seen him give Whitfield or strangers in town, but a real one, the kind that showed in his eyes and changed the whole character of his face. And Clara, across the table, looked very carefully at her cards and said absolutely nothing, which was itself very loud. Bessie lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the Wyoming night sounds, the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods and the distant occasional low sound of the cattle. She was doing an inventory of herself, the way she sometimes did when things were becoming complicated. She was 24. She had no property, no family, and a small amount of savings. She had a job on a ranch in Wyoming that she was good at, and that she did not want to leave. She had, over the past 6 weeks, begun to feel something for her employer that was considerably beyond professional respect, and she was aware that this was dangerous in multiple ways. If he did not feel the same way, it would make her position untenable. If he did feel the same way, she was not entirely sure she knew what to do with it, because she had spent 24 years being told she was not enough, and she had no reliable internal framework for believing that a man like Henry Dalton, steady and honest and unexpectedly tender in the way he held guitar strings at midnight, could look at her and see something worth having. She fell asleep eventually. The creek kept running outside. The stars were very bright over Wyoming. Clara left on a bright Tuesday morning with a hug for Bessie that was warm and uncomplicated and a quiet word in her ear. Be patient with him. He knows what he wants. He's just making sure he's certain before he says it, because that's how he is. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. Bessie held these words the way you hold something fragile and valuable, carefully and close. The summer deepened and the work continued, and the thing between them grew the way things grow in places where there is warmth and patience, and enough quiet to let roots establish themselves properly. They fell into habits. Bessie left coffee warming on the stove for him when he came in late from checking the herd. He brought her things from town when he went in on Saturdays. Not grand things, small things. A spool of the thread she had mentioned needing, a newspaper, once a paper bag of peppermints from the general store that he set on the kitchen table without comment, and which she found there and understood were for her without being told, and ate slowly across 3 days because they were good and because he had thought of her. When the coyotes got into the kitchen garden in late July and destroyed a row of her carrots, she was angrier than she had expected to be, and he spent an evening mending the garden fence to a standard that would keep anything short of a determined bear out. And when he was done, he showed her the work and said, "I think that'll hold now," and she said, "I know it will." And they stood in the evening light with the repaired garden fence between them, and were just two people who were comfortable in each other's proximity, which was its own kind of very important thing. It was August when things shifted. There was a social at the church hall in Harrow Creek, the kind of summer event that small frontier towns organized because community required maintenance, and because people needed reasons to be in the same room together that weren't a disaster or a trial. There was going to be dancing. Domingo was very enthusiastic about this. Billy was nervous in the way of a young man who has recently become interested in the daughter of the town blacksmith, which Bessie had observed and which she found charming. Sam Tucker said he was too old for that kind of foolishness, and then spent the week before the social getting his good shirt pressed, which told a different story. Henry asked Bessie on a Thursday, standing in the doorway of the study where she had been going over the accounts, whether she would like to go to the social, and he asked it with the care of a man who is trying very hard to keep his voice neutral and not entirely succeeding. And Bessie said yes she would, and he said good, that was good, and went back to what he had been doing with the particular speed of someone removing himself from a situation before they can say anything they haven't planned. She wore her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton that she had made herself in Laramie and which fit her well, and which was the only garment she owned that could be described as anything other than practical. She put her dark hair up with the 2 tortoiseshell pins that had been her mother's and looked at herself in the small mirror in her bedroom and thought that she looked like herself, which she had not always thought, and that this was all right. This was enough. She caught the word in her own head and paused with it. Enough, she was not sure she believed it, but she was trying to. Henry was in the main room when she came downstairs, and he turned when he heard her and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open and unguarded and not trying to be anything other than what it was, which was a man looking at a woman he had feelings for and not being able to keep it entirely off his face. He said, "You look beautiful, Bessie." She had been told she was pretty before, in the vague and offhand way that compliments sometimes happen, but she had not been told she was beautiful by someone who was looking at her the way Henry was looking at her, as if the word was not a social grace but an honest observation, and she did not know quite what to do with it, and so she said, "Thank you," and picked up her wrap from the chair, and was very occupied with putting it on for a moment. They rode into town in the wagon together, because it was a long walk, and the evening was warm, and the drive was pleasant, and they talked about unremarkable things along the road, the condition of the south pasture, and whether it was worth getting a new rooster because the current one had a belligerent character that was becoming a practical problem. And this easy domestic conversation in the warm August evening was one of the nicest things Bessie could remember happening to her in a very long time. The social was well attended and loud with music from a fiddle player named Macready, who had a prodigious talent and a large enjoyment of his own ability. The church hall had been cleared for dancing, and the tables along the wall had food contributed by half the women of the town and a great deal of enthusiasm. Billy Marsh found the blacksmith's daughter within approximately 30 seconds of arriving, and that was the last anyone saw of him as a separate entity from her for the rest of the evening. Domingo danced with 3 different women in the first hour with the effortless style of someone who genuinely loved dancing. Sam Tucker sat with the older men and talked ranching and drank lemonade and watched the dancing with an expression that was gruff and pleased. Henry danced twice with Bessie. The first dance was a reel in which everyone was paired, and there was not much opportunity in a reel for anything personal, just the quick movement and the pattern of it, and the fact that you kept returning to your partner's hands. But in the returning there was something, the way his hand held hers, not loosely the way a man holds a woman's hand when it is merely required by the dance, but with a specific intention, like something being held because it matters. The second dance was slower, and they stood closer, and she was very aware of the height of him beside her, and the way he moved, careful and considered, not a natural dancer but an honest one, and she could feel the warmth of his hand at her waist through the blue cotton of her dress. Afterward they stood outside in the August night with a group of people from the ranch circle, and she could feel him standing slightly closer to her than the social situation strictly required, and she did not move away. On the drive home, the quiet between them was of a different quality than the quiet usually was, denser and more aware of itself. The moon was up and bright, and the road home was silver in it. The horses knew the way. Halfway home Henry said, "Did you have a good time?" "Yes," she said, And then, because the evening had loosened something in her, "I haven't been to a social in a long time, years, really." "Why not?" he asked. She considered the question for a moment. "There wasn't anyone to go with," she said, "and going alone felt—" She stopped. "Felt what?" "Like confirmation of something," she said. "I'm not sure I can explain it better than that." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled on. The creek glittered in the moonlight to their left. "I think I understand," he said, and from his tone she believed that he did. The days after the social were charged with something that had not been present before, or had been present but had now become impossible to ignore. Bessie noticed it in the way he looked for her when he came in, the quick scan of a room that was looking for a specific thing. She noticed it in the way conversations that started as practical and domestic would sometimes trail out into something quieter and more personal without either of them quite meaning for it to happen. She noticed it in herself too, in the awareness she had of where he was in the house, the sound of his boots on the stairs, the specific quality of quiet when he was in the study versus when he was outside, the anticipation she felt when she heard his horse in the yard at the end of a day. She was not a woman given to romantic fantasy. She had not spent her years daydreaming about being loved because she had never had much reason to believe it was a thing that would happen to her. But this was not fantasy. This was something specific and present and very much attached to a specific man who had never once said anything to her that was cruel or diminishing, who paid attention when she spoke, who brought her peppermints from the general store and fixed things she mentioned needing fixed, and who played guitar alone at midnight with a gentleness that she thought was probably the truest thing about him. It was a Thursday in late August when the conversation happened that she had been both hoping for and afraid of. She had been in the garden at the end of the day, the low golden light of late afternoon making everything look like it was worth keeping, pulling the finished bean plants and turning the soil over to rest before the fall. Henry came out of the barn and came to the garden fence and leaned on it and watched her work. This was not unusual. He had a quality of being comfortable in silence, which she had come to value enormously, because most silences she had experienced in her life had been loaded with someone's disapproval. After a while he said, "Bessie, can I say something?" She looked up from the soil. Something in his voice was careful in a particular way. "Of course," she said. He took a breath. He was looking at her with the direct, unperformed attention that she had come to think of as the most characteristic thing about him. "I don't want to make things uncomfortable here," he said. "This is your home now, or it should be, and I don't want to do anything that changes that." She waited. She had learned to wait for him. "But I'd be lying if I said things were the same as they were in April when you arrived," he said. "They're not, and I think you know that. I think you know it because you're the most observant person I've ever met." Bessie set down the small hand fork she had been using and stood up straight. Her heart was doing something large and inconvenient in her chest. "Henry," she said, "I'd like to court you properly if you're willing," he said, and it came out simple and direct in the way he said most things that mattered to him. Not elaborate, not performed, just true. "I'm not a man who has a great deal of elegant things to say about how I feel, but I have a great deal of feelings, and they are all to do with you, and I thought you should know it." She looked at him across the garden fence in the late August light and felt something happen inside her that was composed partly of warmth and partly of the particular kind of fear that comes when something you wanted very much turns out to be actually available, and you have to decide whether you are brave enough to take it. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He smiled, the real one, the one that changed his whole face. "Good," he said. And then he said, "I'll let you finish your garden," and went back inside. And she stood in the evening light for a long time just breathing the good Wyoming air and feeling the particular astonishment of being in the exact right place. The courtship was quiet and serious and punctuated by moments of unexpected levity. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, showing her parts of the ranch she had not yet seen, the high meadow above the creek where the wildflowers grew knee-deep in August, the stand of aspens on the north slope whose leaves shivered and flashed in the lightest wind, the high point above the south pasture from which on a clear day you could see the mountains in 3 directions. He was a natural teacher about the land, explaining things not in the way of someone showing off their knowledge, but in the way of someone sharing something they loved. And she listened and asked questions, and felt the land gradually becoming known to her the way you come to know a person, layer by layer, surprise by surprise. She told him things she had not told him before. She told him about her parents and about the homestead her uncle had sold. She told him about Mrs. Holt and about the particular loneliness of 3 years at a boarding house laundry, where nothing she did was ever quite right. She told him that she had grown up feeling like she was perpetually falling slightly short of some standard she had never been shown clearly enough to meet, and that she had mostly accepted this as simply the condition of her life. She told him this on an afternoon when they were sitting by the creek on a flat rock that was warm from the sun, and she told it plainly, without self-pity, but also without the usual protective armor of not mentioning it at all, because she had decided, somewhere between the garden and this creek, that if she was going to be honest with this man, it had to be actually honest. He listened to all of it with the attention he gave to everything. He did not rush to reassure her or to tell her that those people had been wrong about her, which was what she might have expected, the reflexive comfort of social nicety. Instead, he was quiet for a moment after she finished, looking at the water, and then he looked at her and said, "That sounds like it was very lonely." "It was," she said. "I'm sorry you had that," he said. And then, with a simplicity that was so unaffected it almost undid her, "I want you to know that from where I'm sitting, you are more than enough. You always have been. Since the day you got here." She stared at him. The creek ran past them. The aspens shook their light leaves in the wind above. She had never once been told she was enough. Not by her father, who had meant well but had always been reaching for something more she could become. Not by her mother, whose love had been real but tangled with worry and expectation. Not by Mrs. Holt. Not by any of the people who had shaped the particular shape she had become. Nobody had said it, simply and without qualification, the way Henry had just said it, as if it were merely and obviously true. She did not know what to do with it. She felt the back of her eyes go hot, which she was determined to manage, and she looked at the water for a moment and breathed carefully, and then she looked back at him and said, "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It's just true." She looked at his face for a long moment. This honest, steady man who had brought her peppermints and fixed the garden fence and played guitar alone at midnight when he thought nobody was listening. And she thought that she had traveled a very long way from Laramie, and that the saddle strap splitting outside of Harrow Creek had been, possibly, the best thing that had ever happened to her. "All right," she said eventually. "I'll try to believe you." "You'll get there," he said with perfect confidence, and she thought she probably would, with enough time and enough of him. September came and the aspens turned gold, and the mornings were cold and sharp, and the afternoons were still and golden, and the ranch was in the full activity of the fall work, the weaning and the sorting and the preparations for winter. The hands worked long hours. Bessie cooked accordingly, large meals full of warmth and substance, and she kept the accounts and managed the household and found that this life, this particular and specific life, fit her the way almost nothing before it had fit her. She and Henry were easy with each other in the way of people who have moved through something uncertain and arrived somewhere solid. He held her hand when they walked. He kissed her for the first time on a September evening on the porch after supper, carefully, and with the kind of attention he gave to everything. And she stood in the cooling air afterward and thought that she had been right about him, that the most true thing in him was the gentleness, and that this was a remarkable and good thing to know about a person. Clara wrote letters. Clara's letters were long and full of pointed cheerfulness and occasional pointed observation, and in one of them she wrote to Bessie directly for the first time, saying that she was very glad Henry had not ruined things by being too slow about it, and that she had known from the first evening in the kitchen that this was going to happen, and that she expected to be told immediately when anything significant occurred. Bessie wrote back with equal directness and rather enjoyed it. In October, a situation arose that, while not dramatic in the way of the stories told about the Wild West, was serious in the practical way that life on the frontier regularly was. 3 of Henry's cattle were found on the other side of the south fence, and the question of whether they had wandered through a gap or had been moved there by the neighboring Ashford Ranch, which had been in a low-level dispute with the Double D over a contested water access since the previous year, required careful handling. The Ashford Ranch was run by a man named Gerald Ashford, who was not dishonest exactly, but who had a view of boundaries that was convenient to himself, and who had managed to make the water dispute drag on longer than it needed to by employing a lawyer in Casper. Henry handled it himself, riding over to the Ashford Ranch on a Tuesday morning and coming back in the early afternoon with the cattle, and with an agreement in writing, which he had had Ashford sign before 2 witnesses, that the water access question would be referred to the county commissioner for formal resolution rather than being left as a running source of friction. He came into the kitchen afterward and told Bessie about it in the even tone he used for things that had been resolved, and she looked at the paper he put on the table and the 2 signatures on it and said, "How did you get him to agree to the commissioner?" "I told him the alternative was that I would have my own lawyer in Casper file a formal complaint," Henry said, pouring himself coffee, "and that I was prepared to do that, and that I was also prepared to do whatever the commissioner decided, because I knew the water access was ours by the original survey. Ashford didn't want the formal complaint on record." "Good," she said. "And then, you should have a copy of that original survey in the ledger cabinet." He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "I don't have one." "Yes, you do," she said. "I found it in the back of the ledger from 1875 when I was reorganizing. I put it in the envelope in the 3rd drawer." He set down his coffee and looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to love, the one that was partly admiration and partly something warmer and more personal. "Bessie," he said. "3rd drawer," she said. "Behind the estate papers." He retrieved the survey copy, and it was exactly what she had said it was, the original land survey clearly showing the water access belonging to the Double D, and he came back to the kitchen and kissed her on the top of the head with a warmth that was so natural she barely moved, just absorbed it and went on with what she was doing. And this ease, this physical ease and this trust, was one of the things she had not known she was missing until she had it. November brought the first serious snow, and with it the particular intimacy of a household drawing inward against the cold. The hands were in the bunkhouse most evenings, but they came up to the main house for meals, and the kitchen was warm and full in a way that Bessie loved. She had started making bread twice a week, because the cold made everyone hungrier, and because bread making was a process that required her full attention and satisfied something in her that she could not entirely articulate, but that had to do with transformation, with the turning of plain things into something nourishing. Henry had resumed playing guitar in the evenings. He no longer played quietly as if hiding it. One night in November he played in the main room with the door open, and Bessie sat in the room with her mending and listened, and he played for perhaps an hour, moving through different things, some melodies she recognized as hymns or folk songs and some that were his own, she thought, the ones that had the quality of found things. When he stopped she said, "The 3rd one was your own, wasn't it? Not something you learned." He looked at her with a slight flush. "How do you know that?" "It doesn't have the shape of something learned," she said. "It has the shape of something found." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been working on it for about 2 years," he said, "since James died. I couldn't make it feel finished." "I think it's finished," she said. He held this for a moment and then played it again all the way through, and she listened with the full attention she had for things that mattered, and when he finished she said, "Yes, that's finished." He put the guitar down and looked at her across the warm room and said, "I want to marry you, Bessie." She had known it was coming. She had known for some time. But the direct simplicity of it still arrived with full impact, the way certain truths do regardless of how prepared you are for them, She put down her mending. "Are you sure?" she said. "I've been sure since June," he said. "I wanted to wait until you were sure." "I've been sure since July," she said. He laughed, which was not what she expected, a real and warm laugh. "Well then," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Henry, I'll marry you." He crossed the room and sat beside her and took both her hands and looked at her the way he had learned to look at her, with the full particular attention that still made her breath catch because she was still not entirely used to it, and said, "I'll take care of you." "I can take care of myself," she said, which was true. "I know," he said. "I mean something additional to that." She looked at him for a moment. "I know what you mean," she said. They were married in the church in Harrow Creek on the first Saturday of December 1882, when the snow was 6 inches deep on the ground, and the mountains were white and brilliant against a blue sky that seemed too vivid to be entirely real. Clara came from Cheyenne with Thomas, who turned out to be as solid and pleasant as Clara had implied, and who shook Henry's hand with the genuine warmth of someone who was glad for a good thing. The church was small but full, because Harrow Creek was a community that turned out for important events, and because Henry Dalton was a known and respected man, and people were glad to see him happy. Augustus Webb from the blacksmith shop was there, which Bessie found fitting, given that it was his bench she had been sitting on when she first saw Henry coming out of the general store. Domingo Reyes wept quietly during the ceremony and denied this afterward with considerable conviction. Sam Tucker sat in the front pew in his pressed goods shirt and looked stern and moved. Billy Marsh brought the blacksmith's daughter, whose name was Margaret, and they sat together in a way that suggested that situation was progressing nicely. Bessie wore a dress that Clara had helped her make in the week before the wedding, a cream-colored wool that was warm and simple, and that fit her well. And she wore her mother's tortoiseshell pins in her hair, and she walked up the aisle of the little church in Harrow Creek with the particular composure of a woman who has come through a great deal and is now exactly where she is supposed to be. The minister's name was Reverend Hoskins, and he was a decent and straightforward man who kept the service appropriate to the occasion and the weather. When he asked Henry if he took this woman, Henry said yes with the unhesitating directness that characterized everything he said that he meant. When he asked Bessie if she took this man, she said yes with her whole voice, clearly and without qualification, and felt in the saying of it the particular freedom of choosing something for herself, perhaps the first large and permanent thing she had ever chosen wholly for herself. They had their wedding supper at the ranch that evening, 12 people around the dining room table that was generally too large for daily use, and was now perfectly sized, with the food Bessie and Clara had spent 2 days preparing, and with a bottle of good wine that Thomas had brought from Cheyenne, and with enough warmth in the room from the fire, and from the collected goodwill of everyone present to push back comfortably against the December cold. The toasts were heartfelt, and some were funny, mostly courtesy of Domingo, and Clara gave a speech that made Bessie cry, which she had been determined not to do but which she accepted gracefully because Clara had the specific gift of saying exactly true things at exactly the right moment. When everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Bessie stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular piece of a house after celebration, looking at the table that had been full of people and was now cleared and still, feeling the depth of the quiet. Henry came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin gently on the top of her head, and they stood like that in the kitchen of their home on the first night of their marriage in the December dark, while outside the Wyoming winter laid itself quietly over the land, and the creek ran under its edge of ice, and the stars came out over the mountain dark. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was not a mild one. January brought a blizzard that kept them inside for 4 days and deposited snow to the eaves of the barn on the north side. And it was during this blizzard that Bessie discovered the particular pleasure of being snowed in with someone you loved, the concentrated domesticity of it, the board games and the cooking and the long evenings by the fire. Henry taught her to play chess on the same pine board his father had carved, and she was a quick learner, and within 3 days was winning enough games to be genuinely satisfying. He taught her the finger positions for 3 chords on the guitar, though she had no talent for it, and they both accepted this with good humor after the 4th evening of practice produced results that made even the horses in the barn seem uneasy. In the spring of 1883, when the snow was melting and the new grass was beginning, Bessie told Henry she thought she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where most of the important things in their life were told, and she watched his face as she said it go through something she had never seen on him before, a sudden unguarded openness, joy unmixed, the kind of pure uncomplicated delight that most people stop allowing themselves after a certain age and which he had apparently kept accessible. He came to her and held both her hands the way he had the night he proposed, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, "good." And then he held her carefully, with the specific care of someone holding something that has become newly precious in a new way, and she put her face against the worn flannel of his shirt and felt the steady beat of him, and thought that she had come a very long way from a bench outside a blacksmith's shop in a small town in Wyoming territory, and that every mile of the road had been worth it. She wrote to Clara the same day. Clara's reply, which came in under 2 weeks, was long and full of joy and detailed advice, and exactly the right tone, and included a postscript from Thomas that said simply that they were both very glad, and that he was going to make Henry a fine gift to mark the occasion, which turned out to be a new ledger for the ranch accounts with B. Dalton written on the spine in very fine gilt lettering that made Bessie run her fingers over it for a long time the first time she held it. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The ranch prospered. The kitchen garden was the best it had been since Bessie had taken it over, productive and well-tended, and the household ran with a smooth efficiency that meant Henry could spend his time on the cattle, and the land without the house being a source of worry. Domingo Reyes found himself a sweetheart in town, a young woman named Catalina, who was the niece of the man who ran the feed store, and the hands teased him about it in a warm and relentless way that he withstood with great dignity. Billy Marsh and Margaret Webb were making things official, apparently, and Augustus, the blacksmith, had reportedly given his blessing with the enthusiasm of a man who had always liked Billy and was glad his daughter had good sense. Sam Tucker, who had been the most skeptical about all this domestic happiness surrounding him, was observed on 3 separate occasions bringing small gifts to the ranch house for Bessie, things he found or made, a bundle of late wildflowers, a jar of the honey from the hives he kept, a small piece of cottonwood he had carved into the shape of a horse, and when anyone mentioned this, he said the gifts were for the ranch generally, not for anyone in particular, which nobody believed but everyone respected. The baby was born in November, which made it a fall child, Wyoming born during the golden end of the season, just as the first real cold was settling in. It was a boy. Henry had not said which he hoped for because he said it didn't matter to him and Bessie believed him, but she saw on his face when Domingo rode hard to town for Doc Henshaw, and the doctor declared the child healthy, and Clara, who had come 2 weeks early to be there, brought the baby from the small bedroom and put him in Henry's arms, a particular kind of reverence, the careful looking of a man who has been given something too important for ordinary expression. They named him James, for Henry's brother, which had been Bessie's suggestion, made one evening in the summer when they were talking about names, and Henry had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when something hit something real in him, and after a moment he had said, "Yes, I'd like that very much." Clara stayed for 3 weeks after the baby came, which was the right length of time, and which she said was not a holiday but a practical necessity, and Thomas joined her for the last week, and the house was full in the best way. James Henry Dalton, who weighed 8 pounds and had his father's dark hair and his mother's considering eyes, was welcomed into a house that was warm and well-run, and full of love that was both new and deeply established. And he slept in a small wooden cradle that Sam Tucker had made, which was the project Sam Tucker had apparently been working on in the bunkhouse for 6 months, and which was beautiful in the plain and careful way of something made by someone who had put everything he meant to say into the making. The years that followed were good years. Not perfect years, because no years are perfect, and the Wyoming Territory in the 1880s was still a place of real hardship and real uncertainty and real work. And there were the ordinary and occasional extraordinary difficulties of frontier life, bad winters and drought years, and the ongoing difficulty of making a cattle operation financially solid in a decade when cattle prices were not always cooperative. There were illnesses and worries, small ones that turned out to be nothing and one larger one when Bessie herself was sick in the winter of 1885, with a respiratory illness that lasted 3 weeks and frightened Henry badly, though he managed this in his way, by being extremely present and extremely quiet, and by spending entirely too much time in the chair beside her bed reading to her from the Emerson essays and from a novel Clara had sent, until she told him she was well enough to read for herself and he could go be a rancher again, at which point he kissed her forehead and said with considerable relief that he was very glad to hear it. There were good things too, more good things than hard ones, which was the shape of a life that was built well. James grew from a sleeping baby into a curious, energetic, dark-haired child who had his father's steadiness and his mother's watching intelligence, and who followed Henry around the ranch from the time he could walk, seriously attending to everything Henry did with the focused interest of a small person who has decided he is going to understand how things work. Billy Marsh married Margaret Webb in the spring of 1884, and they took a small house in Harrow Creek, and Billy continued working at the Double D. And their happiness was the cheerful and wholesome kind that made other people feel good about things. Domingo Reyes married Catalina in the summer of 1884 at a celebration that lasted 2 full days, and that involved the best food Harrow Creek had seen in several years, much of it prepared by Bessie and Catalina together, in a collaboration that produced, among other things, a mole sauce that Domingo declared the finest thing he had ever eaten, which, given that he had also grown up eating his mother's cooking, was the highest praise available. Sam Tucker continued his gruff and wholehearted residence at the Double D and his periodic bringing of small gifts to the house, which he continued to ascribe to no one in particular. In the late summer of 1885, Bessie told Henry she was expecting again. This time he received the news with a steadiness that was the settled version of the joy she had seen the first time, deeper in the register, more certain of itself. He held her hand and said, "Are you feeling all right?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and smiled the smile. Clara came down from Cheyenne again, which she said was a practical necessity, and which was also clearly something she wanted to do, because Clara Dalton, now Clara Hargreaves, was a person who loved the ranch and everything in it with a fierce and consistent devotion. She arrived with Thomas and their own small daughter, Eleanor, who was 2 and had Thomas's even temper and Clara's opinions, and the house was very full and very loud, and James, who was 2½, was introduced to the concept of a cousin and immediately attempted to share everything he owned with her, including his cradle, which was not practical but was extremely generous. The second child arrived in December of 1885, a girl, and they named her Margaret Ruth, Margaret for Billy's wife, who had been one of the first women in Harrow Creek to become Bessie's true friend, and Ruth for Ruth Grover, who had left the Double D 2 years before Bessie arrived, but who had kept the house well enough that there was something worth coming to, and who had heard about Bessie from someone, and sent a letter of congratulations on the marriage that was warm and slightly surprised in tone, as if Ruth had not been entirely sure anything good would follow her departure, and was pleased to be wrong. Margaret Ruth was born in the same small bedroom where James had been born, with Clara there, and Doc Henshaw and Henry waiting in the main room with the specific torment of a man who is not used to not being able to do anything useful. And when she was declared healthy and placed in her mother's arms, Bessie looked at this small new person and felt the ordinary, extraordinary enormity of it. The fact that this child existed and was here and was healthy and was hers, and that the life around her, this warm and real and imperfect and sufficient life, was also hers. Henry came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Bessie and said nothing for a moment, just held her gaze with all the things he was feeling visible in his face, all of it, the love and the relief and the gratitude and the particular depth of feeling that comes from a man looking at the person who has become the center of his life. "She's perfect," he said. "She is," Bessie agreed. "So are you," he said. She looked at him across the small new head of their daughter and felt herself fully believe it for the first time, or if not fully believe it enough that the rest would follow, that she was enough, that she had always been enough, that the people who had told her otherwise had been wrong in the particular and important way that people are wrong when they fail to look at someone properly, and that Henry Dalton, who looked at everything properly, had been right about her from the beginning. "I know," she said. "I'm getting there." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the same care he used for everything he did, and the fire was going in the hearth, and outside the Wyoming December was holding the land in its cold and brilliant silence, and their son James was asleep in his small bed down the hall, and their daughter was warm and new in Bessie's arms, and the ranch was settled for the night, and all the things that had needed to be resolved had been resolved, and the life they had built together was whole. It was in the spring of 1886, when the ranch was busy with calving, and the kitchen garden was being turned for its fourth season under Bessie's care, that she found the piece of paper she had tucked inside the back cover of the household ledger the previous year, a note to herself that she had never fully articulated until she wrote it, in her own careful hand. "I am in the exact right place." She read it and then she put it back, because it was true and she did not need to do anything further with it. The beans needed planting and James needed his midday meal, and the baby was due to wake from her morning sleep, and Henry would be in from the north pasture by noon, and there was bread on the rise that needed watching. She put on her garden hat and went outside into the Wyoming spring, which was just beginning to happen, tender, and a little raw and full of the kind of green that comes after a hard winter, the specific and unrepeatable green of something surviving and starting again. The mountains were still white at their peaks. The creek was running quick with snowmelt. The cottonwoods were putting out their pale new leaves. The kitchen garden waited, its dark-turned soil ready for whatever she decided to put into it. She stood for a moment in the good morning air, breathing the spring into herself, feeling the weight and the rightness of her life, this specific and real and sufficient life, and then she pulled on her gardening gloves and knelt at the first row and began. The years settled in around the double D the way good years settle, with a solidity that comes from being built on honest things. The ranch grew moderately, as Henry had always intended, not spectacular growth but the careful kind, adding a few more head when the range supported it, improving the barn, replacing the aging fence line on the west boundary with proper cedar posts that would last 30 years. Bessie's accounts remained impeccable, and she was known in Harrow Creek as the person to see when anyone had a question about contract language or land records, because she had a precision with numbers and documents that the town eventually recognized was a genuine talent, and she helped several neighboring families sort through paperwork questions over the years without charging anything for it, because it was something she could do, and because she believed in people having what they needed. James grew into a boy who loved the cattle and the land with the same quiet depth his father did, and who was also unexpectedly musical, which Domingo Reyes claimed credit for on the grounds that he had sung to the boy at an early age. Henry taught him the guitar when he was 6, and the boy took to it with a natural ease that made Bessie suspect some things skipped a generation. Margaret Ruth grew into a bright and determined small person with opinions on everything and a laugh that was her mother's laugh, the one Bessie had taken years to fully claim, and she was adored by everyone at the Double D without exception, including Sam Tucker, who had initially declared himself too old to have strong feelings about babies, and had subsequently been observed on multiple occasions sitting in the main room of the evening with Margaret on his knee, while she pulled insistently at his gray beard, and he pretended to object. Henry and Bessie grew into each other the way two people do when they are honest and present and willing to keep choosing each other past the initial choosing. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong views about practical things, and their disagreements were the kind that were had and then resolved without festering, because neither of them had any patience for things being left unresolved. He still played guitar in the evenings. She still kept the accounts, and the garden and the household with the same focused care she had brought to it from the first day. They still talked in the kitchen, always the kitchen, because that was where they had first really talked, and some habits of place are worth keeping. On an evening in the fall of 1887, when the aspens were at their gold peak and James was nearly 4 and Margaret Ruth was almost 2, and the house was quiet with both children asleep, Bessie came in from checking the kitchen garden, which she was putting to bed for the winter, and found Henry in the main room with the guitar. He looked up when she came in and set the guitar aside, and she sat beside him on the settle near the fire, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him in the way she had learned to lean into him, without reservation, with the full weight of herself, trusting the solidity of him. The fire burned. Outside, the Wyoming fall was cooling toward another winter. The ranch was whole and real around them. Their children slept in the rooms above. "I've been thinking about next spring," Henry said. "Whether we ought to look at expanding the south pasture." "We could," she said. "I'll run the numbers this week." "Good," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Bessie." She said. "I love you," he said, simply, the way he said everything he meant. She looked up at his face, this face she had come to know as well as her own, the honesty in it, the steadiness, the particular way he had of being entirely present when he was present. And she thought again, as she had thought 100 times, about the bench outside the blacksmith's shop and the long road from Laramie and the split saddle strap and the kitchen garden waiting with its dark turned soil, and the moment by the creek when he had said she was enough, and she had not known what to do with it. She knew what to do with it now. She had learned. "I love you," she said, and meant it with the full measure of herself, and the fire kept burning, and the mountains stood white in the distance under the Wyoming stars, and the life they had made together held them both, firmly and warmly and entirely, from that night forward into all the nights that followed.